When I saw my father-in-law standing in the kitchen doorway, holding the box with the red ribbon, something inside me cracked, but not from fear or guilt. From recognition. Recognition of how far I had already gone. Of how close I stood to something I never imagined would happen in my life, let alone here, in this beach house, under this roof. My husband's family had always treated me kindly, but never closely. Never deeply. I was the wife, the mother, the one who planned meals and carried sunscreen and remembered birthdays. But I wasn't seen. Not really. Not until those long, silent mornings with him. Not until his voice said things my husband hadn't said in years, not even to flatter me. Not until I started noticing how my stomach fluttered when he entered a room. And now, he stood there, not saying a word. Just looking. I felt my skin warm, my pulse trip over itself, and I knew I couldn't hide this anymore. Not even from myself. This isn't where it started, though. To understand everything, you need to know what happened the first day we arrived. When the sun was too bright and the air too thick and I was still convincing myself that I was happy. Before I tell you what was in that box, tell me, have you ever crossed a line so softly, so quietly, that you didn't realize how far you'd gone, until it was too late? The house was white with sea-green shutters, tucked behind dune grass and wild fig trees. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place people go to rest. But inside, I already felt the weight of expectation pressing against me. We arrived early in the afternoon. My husband immediately busied himself with luggage and groceries, barking orders out of habit more than rudeness. Our son was already halfway to the beach with his headphones on, indifferent to the familiar tension crackling between his parents. I carried the bag with toiletries, towels, and his mother's old vase wrapped in bubble wrap. I always handled fragile things. The heat inside the house was thick, clinging to the walls and to my skin. I opened the windows, let in the salt air, and stood in the kitchen for a moment, just breathing. Behind me, footsteps moved across the tile. I turned. It was him. My father-in-law looked the same as he always did, tanned from morning walks, a touch of silver in his beard, a calmness I used to find enviable. He smiled, nodded politely, and asked if I wanted help with the unpacking. I said no, of course, and meant yes. The first few hours blurred together in the routine of arrival. Setting up rooms, unpacking sunscreen, placing wine bottles in the fridge. My husband set up his workspace near the window with the strongest Wi-Fi signal and disappeared into a haze of emails and calls. I didn't take it personally. I'd stopped doing that years ago. That night, after the dinner I cooked and they barely commented on, I stood out on the back patio by myself. The sky was ink black, the waves invisible but loud. I watched the moon cut a line across the water and wrapped my arms around myself, unsure if it was from the breeze or from something deeper, something I didn't have a name for yet. He came out quietly, not to intrude but simply to share the silence. "You always make dinner like it's a thankless art," he said, and I laughed without meaning to. It was a strange, short sound that startled even me. "I guess it is," I replied, then added, "but some days it feels more like erasing myself than feeding anyone." He didn't respond. Not with words. But he nodded. As if to say, "I see you." That was the first moment. It didn't feel like a moment then. Just a small crack of light in the dense quiet of my life. The next morning, I was the first to wake up. I always was. I took my coffee alone, walked along the side path that led to the beach, toes pressing into damp sand. I thought about how many years I had spent building a life where no one asked me if I was tired. Or if I needed anything. Or if I wanted to feel beautiful again. Back in the kitchen, I caught my reflection in the microwave's black glass. I looked older. Not worse, just not young. I traced the lines near my mouth, the small tiredness around my eyes. Then I brushed my hair back and added lip balm. I told myself it was habit. Later, as the others woke, the routine re-established itself. My husband requested coffee and asked about the schedule. Our son scrolled through his phone and muttered monosyllables. I made breakfast, wiped the counters, arranged towels for the beach. Around noon, my father-in-law reappeared in the kitchen while I was washing fruit. He didn't say anything at first. Just moved beside me and reached for a knife to help. Peaches or apples, he asked. Peaches, I answered. They bruise like feelings. He looked at me then, really looked, and smiled. You've always had a poetic streak. I remember that. I didn't remember ever showing it to him. The afternoon passed in heavy sunlight and small talk. I stayed mostly indoors, claiming a headache, though the truth was harder to name. I just wanted space. Silence. A chance to sit without performing. Around 4, I noticed him in the garden trimming branches near the patio. He moved slowly, precisely. His shirt was damp from sweat, and he had a towel around his neck. I watched from behind the curtain and hated how long I watched. That evening, I dressed in a soft cotton dress, navy blue, with buttons down the front. My husband didn't notice. My father-in-law said, "That color suits you." It should have meant nothing. It shouldn't have felt like water in a drought. That night, I stood brushing my teeth while my husband scrolled on his phone, lying flat on the bed. He didn't even look up when I entered the room. I lay down next to him and stared at the ceiling, feeling something tighten and pull inside me, an ache I'd buried under routine, under years of polite silence. The ceiling fan clicked slowly overhead, each sound a metronome counting the distance between the life I had and the one I hadn't dared imagine yet. Tomorrow would change something. I could feel it. But not because of fate or magic. Because I was already slipping. And I didn't want to stop. The second day began with a restless kind of energy. I hadn't slept well, though my husband snored beside me like the world had given him peace. My body was still. My mind wasn't. I kept replaying that moment on the patio, the way his eyes had lingered on mine, the unspoken weight behind his words. There had been nothing explicit, nothing concrete. And yet, something had shifted. Something dangerous. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, preparing breakfast while everyone else slept in. The silence helped. It gave me time to organize my thoughts, to breathe in the salty air that wafted in through the half-open window. I fried eggs, sliced fruit, laid out toast. Automatic motions. My hands worked, but my mind drifted elsewhere. I kept wondering if he remembered the way he'd looked at me last night. Whether it had meant anything. Whether he had felt the tremble that passed through me afterward. I told myself I was being foolish. Overthinking. Maybe even projecting. But something inside me whispered otherwise. By the time the others came down, I had everything ready. My husband murmured a distracted thank you, already tapping away on his phone. Our son mumbled something about a beach run and disappeared. My father-in-law entered last, dressed simply in a light linen shirt and shorts. He nodded to me, that same quiet, thoughtful nod. Nothing more. I spent most of the morning cleaning. The beach house wasn't messy, but cleaning gave me purpose. Control. I wiped counters that didn't need wiping, rearranged fruit in the bowl, dusted already dusted shelves. I avoided the living room, where my husband's voice rose occasionally during work calls. Around midday, I stepped out onto the back patio with a glass of water. The heat wrapped around me like a second skin. The air smelled of seaweed and sunscreen. I sat in the shade and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the hum of insects and distant waves lull me into calm. I heard footsteps behind me. Slow. Measured. I opened my eyes. It was him. Again. He asked if he could sit. I nodded. We didn't speak for a while. Just sat there, side by side, the silence hanging gently between us. It wasn't awkward. If anything, it was grounding. Finally, he said, "You always get up before everyone else." I smiled faintly. Old habit. I like the quiet. He didn't respond immediately, then added, "It's the only time the house isn't crowded with other people's noise." I turned my head slightly, watching him. Exactly. He looked ahead, not at me. You make it seem like you don't get much space for yourself. His words sat heavy in the air. I swallowed. I suppose I don't. More silence. But it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things I hadn't said in years. Full of things I was still trying not to feel. That afternoon, the power went out. A fuse had blown, probably from all the devices running at once. My husband groaned from the other room, complaining about his unsaved files. Our son rolled his eyes, grabbed his backpack, and went out to meet friends. I stayed behind. I could have left. Could have gone with them or claimed errands. But I didn't. I stayed. He stayed too. The house dimmed without electricity. No fan. No artificial breeze. The heat grew thick, oppressive. I changed into a lighter blouse, something loose and breathable. I pulled my hair up into a knot. Still, I felt my skin flush. I found him in the kitchen, standing near the open fridge, holding 2 glasses of water. He handed one to me. "Hot enough for you?" he asked. I took a sip. Feels like the air's holding its breath. We both laughed, and it sounded like relief. He gestured to the dining room. "Want to sit somewhere with light?" I nodded, and we moved toward the large table near the window. The sun poured in, washing the table in golden warmth. We sat across from each other. He leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something?" I met his eyes. "Of course. Do you miss the version of yourself you were 10 years ago?" I blinked, caught off guard. It was such a specific question. So intimate. "I don't think I've thought about her in a long time," I admitted. "You should," he said, his voice soft. "She still exists." Something about the way he said it made me want to cry. But I didn't. I just looked down at the sunlight tracing patterns on the wood. The hours passed slowly after that. The power returned eventually, and the house hummed back to life. But the moment had left a mark. That evening, my husband suggested a walk before dinner. I declined, saying I felt tired. He didn't press. He never did. I sat alone again on the patio, watching the horizon darken. The moon hadn't risen yet. The world felt muted. Then I heard the door open behind me. I didn't turn. I knew it was him. He walked to the edge of the patio and stood beside the railing, facing the ocean. "The sky always feels closer at night," he said. I nodded. "It's quieter." He turned to me. "Are you lonely?" The question was too simple. Too raw. But I didn't lie. "Yes," I said. "More than I care to admit." He stepped closer. Not too close. Just enough. I could feel the heat from his body. "I think you've forgotten how to be seen," he whispered. My breath caught. I wanted to move. To leave. To interrupt whatever this was becoming. But I didn't. He raised a hand and gently touched my shoulder, lightly, respectfully. I felt the weight of that contact through every cell in my body. I turned to him. We kissed. It was brief. It was quiet. It was everything. I stood up immediately after, heart pounding, breath shallow. I walked past him, into the house, into the bathroom. I locked the door. In the mirror, my face looked different. Alive. And that terrified me more than anything else. The next morning brought with it a strange clarity, as if the air had been scrubbed clean overnight. I expected to feel guilt, or panic, or shame, but what I felt instead was presence. As if I had finally woken up after years of being half asleep. Still, that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. I was. Every movement felt more visible. Every word more loaded. My husband sat at the kitchen table, already typing away on his laptop, the corner of his mouth moving faintly with concentration. I poured his coffee, just as I always did, placing it to his right, next to the notebook he never used. He didn't look up. He murmured a distracted thanks, not even hearing himself. That had become normal, I realized. Expected. But I wasn't the same anymore. Not entirely. When I stepped into the hallway, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror hanging above the sideboard. I stopped. There was a softness to my eyes, a fullness in my cheeks I hadn't noticed in years. Something had shifted in how I held myself. Not pride, just aliveness. I went to the laundry room and started folding towels. The rhythm calmed me. I matched corners, smoothed edges, tucked corners in as tightly as I could. Everything had to look right, feel controlled. Inside, though, I was unraveling. I kept thinking about the kiss. About how natural it had felt. How effortless. Not rushed or passionate or dramatic, just necessary. Like a breath I'd been holding far too long. And that terrified me. Not because it was wrong, but because it didn't feel wrong at all. He passed by the laundry room once, late in the morning. He didn't pause. He didn't look in. But I felt the air shift when he passed. Like the room took in his presence before I even saw him. I stayed in that room longer than I needed to. Sorting, organizing, wiping shelves. I needed distance. From him. From my thoughts. From the temptation to recreate something that should have stayed in last night. Around noon, I went outside. The garden needed watering. I filled the canister and stepped onto the sun-warmed stones, careful to avoid the moss growing between them. The plants were overgrown, drooping from the heat. I bent down to tie back a stem that had snapped. My knees ached. He appeared beside me without a word, holding the garden shears. I hadn't heard him approach. But there he was, crouching next to me. Our arms brushed as we worked in silence. His hands moved slowly, deliberately. We didn't speak for several minutes. I trimmed a few leaves. He adjusted a stake near the tomatoes. Everything felt ordinary, but it wasn't. "I don't want to make this harder for you," he said quietly. His voice caught me off guard. It was softer than usual. Waited. I didn't answer right away. I pressed my palms against my thighs, dusted off the soil. "It's not hard," I said, finally. "It's confusing." He nodded. "That's fair." Another pause. A bird called in the trees. A breeze stirred the hem of my skirt. "You deserve to be seen," he said. "Not just noticed. Seen." I turned to him. His expression was neutral, careful. But his eyes weren't. "I don't know what to do with that," I replied. "No one said that to me in a very long time." "You don't have to do anything," he said. "I just needed you to hear it." And then he stood and left. Just like that. No drama. No lingering. Just the faint sound of footsteps on stone. I stayed there for a long time, kneeling beside the hydrangeas, wondering how something so small could feel like a tidal wave. The rest of the day passed in a strange rhythm. My husband asked if I wanted to go into town with him. I declined. He didn't push. Our son went off with friends again, leaving the house in near silence. I baked bread. It helped. The measuring, the kneading, the warmth of the oven, it gave me a reason to stay grounded. When it finished baking, I set it on the windowsill to cool, just like I used to do when we first got married. Back when I still believed in rituals as ways to show love. He didn't come back into the kitchen until dusk. We crossed paths as I was setting the table. He didn't touch me. Didn't even speak. But his presence filled the room like perfume. Familiar, quiet, lingering. At dinner, we all ate together. My husband talked about the fishing boat he wanted to rent for the weekend. Our son scrolled his phone between bites. I answered when addressed, smiled when needed. I was practiced in that. But beneath the surface, I was somewhere else entirely. After dinner, I cleaned alone. I told them I liked doing it, but it was a lie. I just didn't want to be around anyone while my thoughts coiled tighter and tighter inside me. I went to bed early. Or at least I tried to. I lay down, the ceiling fan spinning above me, its shadow cutting slices across the walls. My husband scrolled through his phone, lying beside me but miles away. I stared at the ceiling and let the thoughts come. Was this who I had become? A woman who waited for quiet to feel alive? Who feared what she wanted more than what she had? I turned onto my side and closed my eyes. Sleep didn't come easy. My body was tired. My heart was not. Somewhere past midnight, I heard footsteps. Not loud, just the creak of floorboards settling. A soft closing of a door. I didn't move. But my body knew. Knew who it was. Knew that I would feel him tomorrow. In every room. In every word left unsaid. The next morning would bring more silence. More careful choreography. But tonight, I lay still in the dark, knowing I had already crossed something. And once crossed, there is no way back that doesn't leave something behind. The following day began with a heaviness I couldn't shake, like the weight of an unfinished sentence hovering over every movement. I kept thinking about the garden, about our conversation, about the way his voice sounded when he told me I deserved to be seen. It echoed in my mind, repeating itself like a quiet melody I hadn't realized I needed to hear until it was already inside me. My husband was already up when I entered the kitchen. He had his phone tucked between his shoulder and ear, his hand moving a spoon around his coffee in absent circles. I greeted him softly, but he just raised a finger, motioning that he was mid-call. I nodded and turned to the cupboard, pulled out a bowl, and began preparing breakfast. My gestures were slow, deliberate. I was buying time. Time to think. Time to decide what to do with what I was feeling. I wasn't someone who chased trouble. I never had been. I was the peacemaker, the planner, the person who made sure the tablecloth matched the season and the guest towels were always clean. My life had been defined by subtle adjustments, quiet compromises, gentle sacrifices. This wasn't like me. But maybe that was the point. The garden called to me again that morning. The sun was low, the light golden, slanting in just the right way to make the dew on the grass sparkle. I brought out the watering can, not because the plants needed it, but because I did. I needed to move. To do something with my hands. To be away from everyone else. I was halfway through watering the lavender when I heard his footsteps. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. His presence was unmistakable now, like the familiar ache of an old memory. He stopped a few feet behind me and waited. "Can I help?" he asked. I shrugged. "If you want." He stepped beside me, took the watering can when I handed it to him, and continued where I had left off. We worked side by side in silence for several minutes. I focused on the rhythm of the task, tilt, pour, pause. But my heart was no longer in it. He bent down to adjust the soil around a drooping stem, and when he stood up, our arms brushed. The touch was accidental. But not without meaning. I felt the warmth of it long after it ended. "You've changed," he said finally. I looked at him. "Have I?" "Yes. There's a quiet in you now. Not emptiness. Intention." I didn't respond. I didn't know how. Later that afternoon, while the others left for a walk along the beach, I stayed behind. I said I had a headache. No one questioned it. They never did. I closed the door behind them, then stood still in the hallway, listening to the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a blanket. I wandered into the living room, sat on the couch, and stared out the window. I watched the leaves of the trees shift in the breeze, the curtains flutter in the draft. Everything felt suspended. He entered the room without warning. I didn't hear him come in this time. I only noticed him when he sat down at the far end of the couch, not close, but not far either. He didn't speak. Neither did I. We sat in that quiet for a long time. Not tense. Not expectant. Just there. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," he said eventually. "I just don't want to ignore what's there." I turned to him. "It would be easier if we did." "Maybe. But that's not always the same as better." I stared at him for a moment, searching for something to anchor me, logic, reason, an excuse. But nothing came. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out. I remained seated, my hands folded tightly in my lap. "You've spent so much time keeping yourself small," he said, not turning around. "And you've done it so well that no one even noticed. Except maybe me." The words stung. Not because they were harsh, but because they were true. "I don't know how to be anything else," I admitted. "Yes, you do. You've just forgotten." He left the room without another word, and I sat there, staring at the imprint he left on the cushion. That evening, I tried to act normal. I set the table, cooked dinner, smiled at my husband's story about an old friend he ran into on the beach. I nodded at my son's complaint about the Wi-Fi. I even laughed when appropriate. But inside, I was fraying. Thread by thread. When I went to bed, I lay on top of the sheets, fully dressed, the fan spinning above me, casting rhythmic shadows across the ceiling. I replayed every word he had said. Every glance. Every brush of his hand. And I wondered if something felt this natural, this quiet, this inevitable, was it really a mistake? I didn't sleep. Not really. I drifted in and out of awareness, my body heavy, my thoughts loud. The next morning, I rose before everyone else. I went into the kitchen, opened the blinds, and let the light flood in. I made coffee. Set out plates. Folded napkins. And then I stood at the counter and let my hands rest flat on the cool stone. I looked at the space where he always stood when he entered the room. And I waited. Not because I had a plan. Not because I had made a decision. But because something inside me had shifted. And once shifted, some things don't return to place. They find a new one. Even if you don't know where that is yet. The day began without promise, just like the ones before it, early light crawling through the windows, the smell of salt already hanging in the air. I rose quietly, careful not to wake my husband. His sleep was heavy, undisturbed, arms sprawled across his pillow like he had nothing to guard, nothing to fear. I watched him for a moment and wondered when the last time was that I reached out to him during the night. Or when he had reached for me. I couldn't remember. I dressed without turning on the lights, pulling a dress from the suitcase that I hadn't worn in years. It was softer than I remembered, the fabric thinner, like time had worn it down just as it had worn me. But it still fit. It clung gently to my body in ways I hadn't let myself notice in too long. In the kitchen, I moved as if on instinct. Coffee first. Then the hum of the kettle, the clink of mugs, the subtle rustle of cereal boxes. I laid everything out as always, though I knew no one would appreciate the quiet ritual. My husband would stumble in last minute, still half in work mode. My son would grab something on his way out. No one would notice the fresh raspberries I rinsed or the way I folded the napkins with care. But I did it anyway. Because doing was safer than thinking. I was drying a plate when he entered. He paused for a second, just inside the doorway, his hand resting on the frame like he wasn't sure if he should stay. I didn't look up immediately, but I felt it, that shift in the air, that slight rise in pressure that only seemed to happen when he was near. When I did glance over, our eyes met briefly. There was no awkwardness, just an unspoken understanding. Whatever had passed between us hadn't dissolved. If anything, it had thickened in the silence that followed. He crossed the room slowly, opened the fridge, and took out a bottle of orange juice. He poured 2 glasses without asking and handed me one. I accepted it without a word. We stood beside each other, shoulders almost touching, the quiet stretching between us like a thread pulled too tight. "I'm going for a walk down to the dock after breakfast," he said finally, his voice low. "If you feel like fresh air." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He left the glass on the counter and stepped out of the kitchen, leaving me with nothing but the ticking of the wall clock and the sound of my own breath. The rest of the house stirred slowly. My husband emerged in his usual haze, greeting me with a quick peck on the cheek and a distracted question about his charger. Our son appeared 10 minutes later, already wearing his swim trunks, asking if he could take the car to town later. I said yes. No one asked where I was going. They never did. After they left, the house settled into its familiar hush. I finished cleaning up the breakfast dishes, wiped down the counters twice, then stood still in the middle of the kitchen, unsure of what I was waiting for. I went upstairs, brushed my hair, added a touch of color to my lips, and changed into sandals. The walk to the dock wasn't long, 5 minutes at most, but it felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I could uncross. He was already there, seated at the far end, his legs dangling over the edge, toes nearly touching the water. The breeze off the sea tousled his hair, and his shirt fluttered slightly in the wind. He didn't turn when I approached, but I knew he heard me. I sat beside him, careful to leave a sliver of space between us. The wood was warm beneath me, sun-soaked and smooth. We watched the water move, slow and gentle, waves licking the shore like they had nowhere else to be. For a long time, we said nothing. Then he spoke. "I keep thinking about the moment we met. Years ago. At your wedding." I turned to look at him, surprised. "You were radiant," he continued. "Not just because of the dress or the day. You had a spark in you then. You glowed." I looked away, toward the horizon. "That woman feels very far away now." "She's not," he said. "She's right here. You've just been hiding her behind everyone else's needs." The words settled into my chest like stones. I couldn't deny them. I didn't want to. "I don't know how to come back from that," I admitted. "From hiding so long." "You don't have to come back," he said. "You just have to choose something different." We sat in silence again. The water glistened, the gulls called overhead, the air thick with something unspoken. And then, as naturally as breathing, I turned to him. We kissed. It was slow and still. No grabbing, no rushing, just the meeting of lips that carried more weight than I could bear. It wasn't lust. It was recognition. A moment suspended in its own truth. When it ended, I didn't speak. Neither did he. We sat there, side by side, like nothing had happened, though everything had. Eventually, I stood. I should get back. He nodded. Of course. I walked away without looking back. My feet felt light and heavy all at once. My heart pounded like a warning. Or a promise. Back at the house, I washed my hands in the kitchen sink and stared at the water swirling down the drain. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stood there, letting the weight of the day press into my spine. That evening, we had dinner on the terrace. My husband grilled fish. Our son played music from his phone. The world looked normal. It acted normal. But I knew the ground beneath us had shifted. I excused myself early, claiming I was tired. I lay in bed listening to the breeze rattle the windows, wondering how many versions of me had died in silence over the years. And how many more I'd have to bury to survive the rest of this vacation. I didn't regret the kiss. But I didn't know what it meant. Only that something in me had changed. Again. And I wasn't sure who would notice. Or when. The next day unfolded like a whisper. No arguments, no interruptions, no sudden revelations, just the soft slide of hours into each other, with that same undercurrent of unease threading everything together. I went through the motions, but nothing felt casual anymore. Not the sound of the coffee brewing, not the way my husband hummed while brushing his teeth, not even the wind against the windows. It was all too quiet, too aware. At breakfast, my husband chatted about a day trip he wanted to take with our son. A boat ride out to the nearby coves, just the two of them. I listened, nodded, smiled at the right times. When he asked if I wanted to come, I declined with practiced grace, blaming the heat and a dull headache that didn't exist. He didn't press. He never did. They left just after lunch. I stood on the porch and waved, watched the car disappear down the gravel road, and felt my heart settle into a rhythm that was too calm to be natural. I stayed there for a while, arms crossed loosely over my chest, the sun warming the boards beneath my feet. Inside, the house was still. I wandered from room to room without purpose, checking things that didn't need checking. Straightening frames, adjusting throw pillows, refolding a blanket that hadn't been touched. The silence had teeth. I didn't expect to see him again so soon. He had been quiet the day before, keeping his distance since our kiss on the dock. But now, with the house emptied, our paths were no longer split. We were two people suspended in the same stillness, with nothing left between us except the unspoken truth. I found him in the backyard, tending to the herb garden. His hands were deep in the soil, forearms streaked with dirt, the sun casting a long shadow beside him. He didn't look up when I approached, but he knew I was there. I stopped a few feet away and watched. It wasn't the work he was doing that drew me in, it was the quiet rhythm of him. The way he moved without rush. The way the air seemed to slow around him. You always find something to care for, I said, breaking the silence. He sat back on his heels and wiped his hands on his pants. Things need tending. Otherwise they rot. The words sat heavy between us. I sat down on the grass, tucking my legs beneath me. The sun was strong, but not punishing. A breeze curled in from the sea, wrapping around us like a shared breath. We didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing that needed saying, not really. The weight of what had passed between us was enough. Eventually, he looked at me. You okay? I nodded. Yes. I think so. He didn't ask more. And I didn't offer. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, not as lovers, not as conspirators, but as two people suspended in a moment neither of us had intended. We trimmed the garden, repotted a few plants, even sat for a while in the shade of the porch drinking lemonade. It would have looked ordinary to anyone watching. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. I kept stealing glances when I thought he wasn't looking, watching the lines around his eyes when he squinted at the sun, the way he moved his hands when he explained something, the curve of his mouth when he smiled. There was a kind of gentleness in him that I hadn't known I craved until it was right in front of me. Late in the afternoon, a cloud rolled in from the water, casting everything in silver light. He stood, stretched, and said he was going inside to shower. I nodded and stayed on the porch, listening to the creaking of the boards beneath me, the faint call of gulls in the distance. When I went back inside, the house was cooler. Shadows moved across the hallway. I passed by his room without meaning to, slowing just enough to hear the faint sound of water from behind the closed door. I paused, hand on the wall, heart ticking in my chest like a metronome that couldn't keep time. I moved on. In my own room, I peeled off my dusty clothes and changed into a fresh blouse. I brushed out my hair, tied it back, then untied it again. Everything I did felt deliberate and useless at once. I walked into the kitchen and began preparing dinner, even though no one was home to eat it yet. Chopping vegetables, marinating meat, setting out dishes. My hands worked while my mind drifted, hovering somewhere between restlessness and clarity. When he entered the room, I didn't turn around. I felt him, though, the shift in the air, the slow draw of his breath. He stopped a few steps behind me and waited. I should leave, he said quietly. My knife stilled against the cutting board. Why? Because it's easier than pretending nothing's happened. I turned then, facing him fully. His arms were crossed loosely, eyes searching mine. I couldn't tell if he was angry, or sad, or something else entirely. We didn't do anything wrong, I said. He raised an eyebrow, half smiling. That's debatable. I leaned against the counter. I mean it. We didn't lie. We didn't make promises. We didn't even say what it meant. But we both know it did mean something, he replied. I looked down at my hands, resting against the cool tile. Yes, I whispered. We do. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was full of awareness, of consequence, of choices we hadn't yet made. Eventually, he nodded. I'm not trying to run from this. I just don't want to make it harder for you. You're not, I said. I already made it harder for myself. He left then, with a quietness that felt like respect, not retreat. That evening, when my husband and son returned, I welcomed them with dinner already plated. My husband smiled and kissed my cheek, commenting on the smell of garlic and rosemary. My son asked if we could go paddleboarding tomorrow. I agreed. We ate together, and no one asked about my day. No one noticed the shift in my expression, the stillness in my hands, the way my gaze lingered too long on the flicker of candlelight. After dinner, I stood in the backyard alone, looking up at the stars. The wind had picked up. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked, and I knew he was still awake. We didn't speak that night. But we didn't need to. Because the space between us was no longer defined by what hadn't happened. It was defined by what had. And what might. They left again the next morning, this time for a full-day outing to a nearby island. My husband had planned it the night before with enthusiasm he rarely directed at me. He stood in the hallway, explaining the itinerary while buttoning his shirt, already glancing at the time as if worried he'd missed some invisible deadline. I told him I wasn't feeling great, a small lie cushioned with a smile. He barely looked up. He just kissed the top of my head out of habit and said they'd be back after dark. The car pulled away shortly after breakfast, and I stood at the window, watching the dust settle back onto the gravel road. The house exhaled in their absence. The silence it left behind was thicker than usual, denser, more aware. I didn't move for a while. I stood in the kitchen, one hand resting on the counter, the other holding my coffee, now lukewarm. I tried to shake off the weight of anticipation, but it clung to me like humidity. I was still wearing the same cotton dress from the day before, soft from years of washing. I hadn't thought about changing. I hadn't thought about much at all. The day stretched before me in a way that felt dangerous. Not because of what I planned, there was no plan, but because of what I wouldn't be able to deny anymore. I went upstairs and opened the windows in every room. The breeze moved through the house like it had been waiting for permission. I gathered sheets from the linen closet and remade the guest beds, smoothed out wrinkles in the duvets, fluffed pillows. I swept the porch. I wiped down the already clean counters. I did all the things I normally did to feel useful. But nothing quieted the current humming beneath my skin. It was late morning when I heard footsteps. I was folding napkins at the dining room table. He entered through the back door, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, as if this was just another day. As if we were just two people in the same house with nothing between us but time. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Not right away. He placed the bag on the kitchen island and pulled out a few items, a bottle of wine, a loaf of bread from the local bakery, fresh herbs. His movements were calm, casual. He looked at me once, briefly, then continued unpacking. I figured we could cook something simple, he said, his voice easy. Since it's just us. I nodded. My throat felt tight. Sure. It felt like we were performing a scene for no one. The ingredients, the tools, the careful distance, it was all part of a rhythm we both understood but didn't dare disturb. We chopped vegetables side by side. I stood at the stove stirring, while he grated cheese with focused precision. Occasionally, our arms brushed. Once, we both reached for the salt at the same time. Neither of us moved away quickly. We plated our food and carried it to the shaded patio outside. The air was warm but not suffocating. The sky above the trees shifted between clouds and clear. We ate in near silence, not because we had nothing to say, but because saying anything too soon might break the fragile balance we had constructed. After the meal, I cleared the dishes and brought them inside. When I returned, he was standing near the garden, hands in his pockets, gazing out toward the sea. I joined him without a word. For a while, we said nothing. The waves in the distance crashed rhythmically. The wind played with the hem of my dress. You didn't ask me to come here, he said finally, quietly. But I came. I didn't expect you to, I replied. He turned slightly toward me. Would you have been disappointed if I hadn't? I hesitated. I think so. There it was. Simple. Honest. A truth that hung between us like a suspended bridge. We stood like that for a while, not touching, not moving, but entirely connected. The sun had dipped low when he suggested we go inside. I nodded. The house was dim, the light softer now. I poured us both a glass of the wine he brought. We sat in the living room, on opposite ends of the couch, turned slightly toward each other. He asked me about my childhood. About things I hadn't thought of in years. We spoke slowly, carefully, not wanting to leave the comfort of the surface but not staying entirely on top of it either. He told me about his first job, his mother's stubbornness, the way he used to feel invisible in his own home when his wife was still alive. I told him about the day I realized my husband no longer really looked at me, how I once cried in the car alone after a family dinner, not because anyone was cruel, but because no one noticed I hadn't spoken in hours. We didn't cry. We didn't reach for each other. But the space between us became something else. Something that pulsed quietly with understanding. The hours slipped by unnoticed. The sky outside darkened. Crickets began to sing in the garden. And then, as naturally as if it had always been meant to happen, we stood. He offered his hand. I took it. We didn't speak. We didn't explain. We just moved together through the house, slow and silent, the floorboards creaking softly beneath our steps. The rest doesn't need to be detailed. We spent the night together. What I will say is this: it wasn't reckless. It wasn't wild. It wasn't even desperate. It was quiet. Gentle. Honest. The kind of intimacy that doesn't need to be hidden in shadows because it already lives in silence. By morning, everything would change again. But that night belonged to us. Not in fantasy. Not in fiction. In truth. In breath. In the space between two people who chose, for once, not to look away. The morning after didn't arrive with regret. It arrived with a kind of disoriented stillness, like the quiet that follows a snowfall. Everything was the same, yet rearranged. The familiar shape of the room, the texture of the bedsheets, the way light spilled through the shutters, they all held a different weight now, not heavier, but sharper. I lay still for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts tangled in threads I didn't know how to pull free. I could hear him in the kitchen. The soft clink of a glass. The creak of a cupboard. Nothing urgent. Nothing invasive. Just someone going about a morning as if it were any other. That, more than anything, grounded me. It reminded me that life doesn't wait for us to make sense of things. It just continues. I rose quietly, collected my clothes, dressed slowly. My body felt unfamiliar, not because of what had happened, but because of how differently I now carried it. Not with pride. Not with shame. Just with presence. I no longer felt like an outline. I felt like something solid again. When I stepped into the hallway, the scent of coffee reached me. That scent, so ordinary, now held a meaning it hadn't before. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, listening. I expected nerves. Panic. But all I felt was calm. Tense, yes, but not afraid. He was at the table when I entered the kitchen, a mug between his hands, the newspaper folded beside him. He looked up and gave a faint smile, one that didn't ask questions or demand anything. Just acknowledgement. I nodded once and moved toward the coffee pot. We didn't speak for several minutes. I poured my cup, stirred in a little milk, and stood by the window, looking out at the garden. The same rosemary bush, the same bending lavender. Yet it all looked more alive, as if the air itself had taken on color overnight. I made eggs, he said after a moment. If you want some. I turned toward him. Thank you. We ate together without ceremony. It was almost mundane, which in itself was startling. I kept waiting for something to break awkwardness, silence, guilt, but nothing did. And that was perhaps the most unsettling part. How natural it felt. After breakfast, we cleaned up side by side, just like the day before. Our hands moved automatically, rinsing, drying, stacking. Every motion echoed a kind of rhythm we hadn't rehearsed but somehow knew. It wasn't intimacy in the physical sense anymore, it was something deeper. Something wordless. When the dishes were done, we didn't linger. He stepped outside to check on the garden. I returned to the bedroom and changed into clean clothes. The rest of the house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that holds its breath. Later, while sweeping the back porch, I caught a glimpse of myself in the glass door. I stood a little straighter. My eyes looked clearer. There was a steadiness in my movements I hadn't noticed before. Not confidence, exactly. Something quieter. Self-recognition. The rest of the day unfolded in small motions. I washed towels, rearranged the books on the living room shelf, called my sister to check in without mentioning anything real. He stayed mostly outside, pruning the citrus tree, cleaning the patio chairs. We barely crossed paths, but the space between us had changed. It wasn't filled with tension. It was filled with knowing. Mid-afternoon brought clouds. The light dimmed, the wind picked up. I lit a candle in the kitchen, more for the ritual than the light. I liked the way the flame danced gently, as if undecided. The rain didn't come, but it felt like it might. Around 4, the car pulled into the driveway. I heard the doors slam, the shuffle of flip-flops, laughter from my son as he recounted some joke I couldn't hear. My husband's voice rose above his, calling for someone to grab the cooler. The house shifted again. I stood at the sink and braced myself. Not because I had done something terrible, but because I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And now I had to learn how to live with that. They entered full of sand and stories. My son gave me a shell he found, still wet from the sea. My husband kissed my cheek and commented on how rested I looked. I thanked them, smiled, asked about their day. My voice sounded normal. My hands moved with purpose. No one noticed anything different. And maybe that was the hardest part, how easy it was to return to the surface of things. Dinner that evening was simple. Grilled vegetables, pasta with olive oil and lemon. My husband poured wine. My son talked about paddleboarding and sea caves. I listened, nodded, laughed at the right times. Across the table, he said nothing. He passed the salt, refilled the water, and never once looked at me too long. But the silence between us still buzzed with something unspoken. After we ate, I washed the dishes while the others drifted outside to sit by the fire pit. I could hear their voices, the low hum of a familiar life. The life I had built, the life I belonged to, the life I had temporarily stepped out of. I finished cleaning, dried my hands, and joined them. The night was cooler now. A blanket was draped across the back of a chair. I pulled it around my shoulders and sat next to my son, who leaned against me without question. We watched the flames dance, listened to the crickets and the occasional crackle of burning wood. The stars blinked above us, distant and indifferent. At some point, my husband leaned over and brushed my arm with his fingers. A casual gesture. Automatic. But it made me flinch internally, and that reaction stayed with me long after everyone went to bed. Later, lying beside him in the dark, I stared at the ceiling, wondering what came next. Not between me and the man downstairs. But between me and myself. The woman I had been yesterday was gone. The woman I had become tonight didn't have a name yet. But she was here. She was awake. And she was no longer content to live quietly in the margins of her own story. The day after felt like the beginning of a shift I couldn't name yet. Nothing happened on the surface, no confrontation, no whispered words behind closed doors. But inside me, something had tipped. It wasn't panic or regret. It was awareness. A sharpness in how I moved, how I observed, how I responded to everything around me. I woke early, long before the others. I watched the sky go from slate to pale blue, the first light drawing quiet shapes across the bedroom ceiling. My husband slept beside me, curled slightly toward the edge, one hand tucked under the pillow, breathing slow and steady. I watched him longer than usual. Not because I felt guilt or affection, but because I was trying to remember when we had last looked at each other without expectation. Downstairs, the air was cooler than it had been in days. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and opened the windows, letting the early breeze move through the house. It felt good to be alone in the silence again, though it wasn't the same silence as before. This one had weight to it, history. I prepared coffee and sat at the kitchen table, cradling the mug with both hands, letting the warmth settle me. I replayed the past few days in fragments, the walk to the dock, the garden, the shared cooking, the night we didn't name. Each memory felt like a stone dropped in water, ripples stretching into everything else. What scared me most wasn't the risk of being caught. It was the realization that I hadn't felt like myself in years, and now that I did, I wasn't sure how to return to who I used to be. By the time the others came down, I was dressed, composed, already moving through the day like I always had. My husband mentioned a few errands he needed to run. Our son wanted to meet a friend at the market. I told them I'd stay back, clean up, maybe go for a walk. They didn't question me. They rarely did. Once the house was empty again, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The quiet was immediate. I moved through the rooms slowly, not because I was lost in thought, but because I wanted to absorb every detail. The light on the wooden floor. The creak of the door hinge. The way the shadows shifted just slightly across the hallway wall. I found him outside, seated in the corner of the garden, book resting on his lap, unread. He looked up when he heard me but didn't speak. I sat beside him on the bench, not too close, our knees just barely not touching. For a long time, we didn't say a word. We didn't have to. Being there, in the open, without the veil of a specific reason, it was its own statement. Eventually, I broke the silence. They're gone for a few hours. He nodded. I figured. The moment could have tilted either way, toward conversation, toward confession, but we let it settle in stillness. It wasn't about reliving what had happened. It was about recognizing what couldn't be undone. I stood first, brushing my hand across my skirt as I rose. I'm going to walk into town. Do you need anything? No, he said. But thank you for asking. That small politeness, so simple, so mundane, somehow tightened something in my chest. I turned and walked away before it could grow roots. The path to town was familiar, even comforting. A narrow sidewalk flanked by dry grass and weathered fences. I passed the same pale yellow mailbox I always did, the same house with the wind chimes that danced in the ocean breeze. Everything looked unchanged. But I wasn't. At the market, I bought lemons, fresh thyme, and a loaf of seeded bread. I chatted with the woman behind the counter, made note of a new bulletin board by the entrance, pretended my life was ordinary. It wasn't even a performance, it was muscle memory. Walking back, I moved slowly. I didn't want to arrive too quickly. I needed the time to think, to breathe. I wondered what I was becoming. Not who I had become already, but what version of myself was forming in these quiet decisions, these pauses, these glances I pretended not to return. When I got back, the house was again in motion. My son was playing music from the living room. My husband was unpacking bags from the car. They both asked about my walk. I told them it was fine. I held up the bread and lemons like proof that I had done something useful. The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet domestic rhythm. Chopping vegetables. Folding laundry. Setting the table. But I felt disconnected from the performance of it all. Like watching myself play a part one knew too well. He didn't speak to me again that day. We shared space, shared air, but not words. It wasn't avoidance. It was restraint. A choice to let the quiet speak for us, at least for now. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the light turned honey-colored, I stood by the kitchen sink drying dishes when I caught a glimpse of him walking through the yard, toward the small shed near the edge of the property. He paused for a moment, hands in his pockets, then kept going. It was nothing, and yet it felt like everything. A reminder that even without touch, without words, presence alone could carry weight. After dinner, my husband and I sat on the porch for a few minutes while my son cleaned up inside. He handed me a glass of wine, talked about a client call he had to take early the next morning. I listened. I nodded. I smiled. I let him reach for my hand and rest it on his knee. And I stayed there, pretending it didn't feel unfamiliar. That night, as we got into bed, he fell asleep within minutes, the day sliding off him like a coat. I lay beside him, eyes open, heart quiet but restless. I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. I was afraid of the part of me that had begun to crave it. The final morning began like the others, with light breaking through the blinds and the sound of birds gathering near the porch. But something in the air felt different, tighter, as if the house itself sensed that something was coming to an end. I woke before my husband and lay still for several minutes, listening to his steady breath. My body was calm, but my thoughts were racing. I could feel a shift building beneath the surface, something I could no longer keep beneath control. I dressed in silence, pulling on a clean blouse and linen pants, my hands moving with precision. I smoothed my hair into a low knot, not out of vanity, but to feel put together. I needed to feel composed, anchored. I didn't know what the day would bring, only that it would bring something. Downstairs, I began preparing breakfast as usual. The familiar sounds of the kitchen comforted me, the scrape of the toaster, the bubbling of water in the kettle, the soft thud of the refrigerator closing. I placed everything on the table with care, arranging fruit, cutting bread, setting out plates and napkins. I wasn't performing. I was preparing. My husband came in groggy, mumbling about a meeting he had later. He sipped his coffee and didn't look at me once. My son followed soon after, phone already in hand, talking about a message from a friend. I nodded, answered their questions, passed the butter. None of it mattered, and all of it did. He entered last. He stepped into the kitchen with a measured calm, like someone fully aware of the ground beneath his feet. Our eyes met briefly, but nothing passed between us. Not in words. Not in expression. But I felt something tighten inside me the moment he crossed the threshold. He said good morning to everyone, poured himself a glass of juice, and sat at the far end of the table. I stayed near the counter, leaning against it with my arms crossed gently. I was watching, not waiting. The conversation flowed around us. My son talked about leaving that afternoon to meet friends at the boardwalk. My husband confirmed they'd drive back to the city the next morning. I nodded along, trying to ignore how my breath had begun to catch at the top of my chest. At one point, my husband looked at me. "You've been quiet." I shrugged. "Just tired." He didn't question it. He never did. After breakfast, the house began its weekend shuffle. Bags were half-packed, towels gathered from the line, leftover groceries sorted. I found small tasks to keep me occupied, folding laundry, sweeping the hallway, wiping down surfaces that didn't need wiping. Then, just before noon, I returned to the kitchen and stopped short. There, on the counter, was the box. It was small. Simple. Wrapped in a soft red ribbon. My breath hitched. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. My fingers hovered above it for a moment, then withdrew. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. I looked around. The house was too quiet. The others had gone to the beach. He must have left it when no one was watching. I stood there for several minutes, my heart beating so loudly I was sure it echoed off the walls. Eventually, I picked up the box, carried it to the bedroom, and tucked it into the back of my closet, beneath a folded towel. I wasn't ready. The rest of the afternoon moved in waves. I read a book in the garden but couldn't focus on the words. I folded the same blanket twice. I answered a text from my sister with emojis, unsure what tone to strike. I kept thinking about the box. About the red ribbon. About the part of me that had wanted to open it. By the time sunset began to spread across the horizon, the house had filled again. My husband returned from the beach with wet towels and new stories. My son laughed as he described the size of a fish he hadn't caught. I smiled. I laughed. I asked if anyone wanted lemonade. Dinner was simple. Pasta and salad, eaten in near darkness on the porch because someone forgot to replace the light bulb. I listened to their voices, the familiar rhythm of our family. I tried to make it feel like home. It didn't. Afterward, my husband disappeared upstairs to take a call. My son went to lie on the hammock with his music. I gathered the dishes slowly, hoping the time alone would still the pulse in my throat. It didn't. I was standing at the sink, sleeves rolled, hands in warm soapy water, when I heard the door behind me open. I didn't turn. "I didn't mean for you to find it like that," he said quietly. "I know," I answered, my voice just above a whisper. I kept washing the plate in my hands, though it had already been clean. I was shaking, but not with fear. With restraint. "You don't have to say anything," he added. "I just needed you to know that I meant it." I turned to him then, dishcloth still in hand. He looked at me, not expectantly, not pleading. Just present. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted. He nodded. "Neither do I." We stood there, neither of us moving, until footsteps thundered down the stairs. My son appeared in the hallway. "Hey, have you seen my charger?" My hands dropped instinctively. I grabbed a towel, dried them. "Check the living room," I said. He nodded and vanished. When I turned back, the kitchen was empty again. Later that night, once everyone had gone to bed, I crept downstairs. I opened the closet door, pulled out the box, and carried it to the kitchen. I sat alone at the table, the ribbon curled beside my hand. Inside the box was the costume. Black. Sleek. Not revealing, but unmistakable. And suddenly, I wasn't alone. My son stood in the doorway. Silent. Frozen. He looked at the box. Then at me. He said nothing. I said nothing. The silence fractured something between us that would never fully heal. And in that moment, I knew everything had changed. And it would never go back.